I'd like you to imagine for a moment that you live in outer suburbia of Perth or even Bunbury. You're next to close to a market garden, so you can get access to fresh fruit, fresh vegetables, and it's a nice spring day. It's on the weekend. You're getting ready for to have a nice cuppa over the veranda, and then you hear from afar sprinklers come on. And then in a few moments, you start coughing and your eyes start watering. So what's that? So what's happened there was that people were being affected by chemicals that's been applied onto the soil. It's been disturbed during the sort of, withholding period. You're supposed to leave it for a couple of days before you get back in. The operator had gone too soon, and when the sprinklers came on, it wafted all the fumes across to where you're standing. So that's what we're talking about in this session, just briefly about some tips on chemical safety, so that with some of these tips, you can be safe on your farm. We'll look at some differences between dangerous goods and hazardous chemicals, a bit of the laws, and some safety information will go into it. And I'll put a plug for our counterparts in Safe Work South Australia, because they have a very useful, simple video on chemical safety. So you be very familiar about the different classes of dangerous goods. We see them on labels over many years. I know of recent times we've seen more of the pictograms in the GHS space. But they're complementary systems. So I guess dangerous goods is a subset of the wider hazardous chemicals space. I'll focus my talk on the Dangerous Goods Safety Act and regulations as it pertains to the farm. So we have the Dangerous Goods Code, which is based on United Nations, and it gives you how you to package goods, how to classify, how to label. And within the storage and handling regulations, we have some specific requirements for farms. Now, when I talk about farms, these are outside the metropolitan area. They're more than 5 hectares in area, and mainly for agriculture, horticultural, and so on. So that's when you're using it for primary production. So that's more a reference point for you. We won't go through the detail. So what type of chemicals do you have on the farm? Obviously, you've got the fuel. Some of you will have petrol. A lot will have diesel. And obviously gas, if you don't have reticulated gas, which you're unlikely to have in country WA, apart from the big cities. Of course, you have pesticides. Some of them are very toxic, like 1080, the baits. Aluminium phosphide fumigants for the grain. I know the CBH, obviously, you have that for your grain silo before export to kill the weevils. And of course, the pre-emergence and post-emergent herbicides as well. And also pre-treatment chemicals like methane sodium, which, by the way, was the subject of that introduction that I made earlier. It actually happened in suburban Perth in 2012, resulting in someone being hospitalised for 3 days. So we need to respect the chemicals safely and use it safely. So one of the bits of information that is super key in safety is the safety data sheet. You need to follow the information that's in there, and if you're unsure, do talk to the manufacturer. They produce those sheets. I know sometimes people copy data sheets because they haven't done their basic info themselves. So do read it through. It gives you information as to the classification, some safeguards, and then how to use it and how to store the chemicals safely. Of course, there's the separate instruction of how to use it safely as opposed to chemical reactions. So what do we need to do to store it safely on farms? One thing is to understand a bit of chemistry, some basic ones. For example, pool chlorine. If you have a need for pool chlorine over on your farm, keep it away from acids because mixing those two will unleash the chlorine genie. And chlorine is obviously very toxic. It is used for sanitizing our water. Bleach and acids. Of course, don't have to say, keep away dangerous goods from foodstuff because of the toxics and contamination. Oxygen and LP gas, acetylene, keep them apart unless you, of course, get it on a trolley ready to use. Security, very important, and we touch on that in your checklist to keep the chemicals secure. Particularly important for highly toxic chemicals out there. And of course, on farms, you have families living there and young kids. We don't want them to access those chemicals. And sometimes on farms, you might have tight spaces and you want to put all these things in one corner, but you have vehicles coming through, the harvester, or just general trucks going through. So you need to place those dangerous goods away from harm so you don't have a chance of colliding with it. I put the LP gas one there, and one time, I'm taking it off the farm now, one time we had someone filling up at a service station, just an ordinary event. But this person was just had a bereavement in the family, plenty on her mind. And instead of, there was oncoming traffic, and instead of pressing on the brake, floored the accelerator and hit one of these LP gas cylinders onto a busy roadway. So collided with a bollard, hit the 190 kg cylinder, which was full, propelled it onto the main road. Fortunately, there was no breach of the cylinder and no fire. So do place it in the right spots. Some big farms may have underground tanks because they don't want to have large storage tanks above ground, lack of space. But I don't think there's many on farms now. We've seen a few, but not so much now, mainly at service stations. But there are some requirements if you need some details there. And how do we handle safely? Obviously, going back to the safety data sheet, gives you all the information, hazard info, storage and handling information, spills management, and PPE. Ignition sources are important, particularly if you're handling gas. Sometimes you might need to refill your forklift. You're doing decanting. When you're decanting, that means you're just transferring through a hose arrangement to your cylinder from a supply cylinder, and you've got gas coming out. You don't want to be smoking at that time. You don't want to be doing angle grinding. These are potential sources of ignition. And of course, in some industries, you don't want to bring your mobile phones or your smartwatches into those areas because they are potential ignition sources. I know in some of the oil and gas, they're very strict. They want you to take off your smartphone, your mobile phone, put it in that box, thank you very much. And I know even some of the fumigant storages where they've got aluminium, you've got phosphine there, you don't want those ignition sources there. So you have to be very careful as to understanding the hazard of that chemical you're handling. So we talked about induction training, part of your checklist, to make sure that the workers have the knowledge on how to use the chemicals safely. Correct application, just like that methampsodium incident. Had you followed the instruction, then you could coexist happily without having the health effects. And correct use of PPE if you need it. Of course, spills do happen from time to time, and you need to have a spill kit to clean up and make sure you know how to deal with it. Sometimes you have incompatible chemicals stored in the same building. Make sure they don't mix. We talked about segregation earlier. Acids, even alkalis. You think, oh yeah, it just forms water in the end, but the reaction could be so violent and it could splutter and hit you in the face. So I need to clean it up very quickly.
With the chemical order picked up and delivered and now home on the farm, it's time to make sure it's stored correctly and safely. Chemicals must be stored as soon as they get to the farm, and there's some basic rules to follow. The storage area must be secure and locked whenever it's unattended. The storage area should also be constructed so that any spills or leaks are contained within the storage area. Some ways to do this are with bunding, such as a low wall or barrier around the edge of the storage, or by having a slightly sloping floor which drains into a sump. Storage areas must be ventilated to prevent the build-up of fumes. This example from the Eyre Peninsula is a decommissioned shipping container with added ventilation, which provides a simple, secure and well-ventilated example of a chemical storage facility. Ensure that clean water is available at all times within the storage area in case of spillage or emergency. The chemical storage area must have an appropriate sign on the outside of the storage facility. Remember, keep a folder of chemical safety data sheets in the storage area and ensure all people in your business who are working with chemicals understand correct storage requirements. Once stored, it's important that chemicals are able to be easily identified. For this reason, ensure that chemicals are left in their original containers and are correctly labelled. Never store chemicals in containers which could be mistaken for storing food or drink. It's also important that any employees with access to the chemical storage area and who are working with chemicals have the appropriate chemical handling accreditation. When chemicals are stored, make sure incompatible or different chemical types are kept separate to avoid cross-contamination. Chemicals should never be stored with seeds, fertilisers, protective clothing or stock feed. Be sure not to store liquid chemicals above solids and separate different classes of chemicals to prevent reactions. For further information, visit the SafeWork SA website at safework.sa.gov.au or call 1300 365 255.
Okay, just seeing the safety shower and eye wash combination unit, just reminded me to just remind you all that very important to check them regularly. I went to site probably a couple of weeks ago, and as we normally do as inspectors, can you please show us that you have the right coverage and the right flow rate? And I was just trying to take some footage, just to make sure it's all okay, and black stuff came out. I don't want to see that. Obviously, it had not been tested, and the flow rate, obviously, it all started, the eye wash is fine, and then when you do a simultaneous operation, the flow just went right down. Another example, I went to do this test. I said, please, my co-worker will check the flow. I went to the loo. They were doing a test, and I pressed the flush, and then the flow just went. So it must be fit for purpose, making sure the flow rate is correct. Because if you need to use it, I don't want to have any foreign matter coming into my eyes. So, a couple of things to finish off. Empty containers, as on farms, if you use lots of chemicals, lots of containers at the end. However, there is a recycling initiative through AgSafe Drum Muster program. They usually triple rinse and all that. There's a collection service, so you can reuse the containers for the future. And there are some reusable containers as well that's in the industry. And finally, keeping all the unwanted chemicals in your shed is not a good idea. It presents unnecessary risk to people, animals, and the environment. And AgSafe's ChemClear, another program, just helps collect those unwanted surplus chemicals. So just to keep it to a minimum. So we have other guidance available if you want more information on specific topics like fuel storage, LP gas, pesticide storage. There are Australian standards you can purchase and download, or you can also have a look at our storage and handling guide, which has more information there, or the Australian Dangerous Goods Code. In summary, some chemicals stored on a farm are dangerous goods, and you need to be stored safely. So by applying good risk control measures, you'll make sure you'll achieve a safe workplace. Okay, thank you.
Don't go away just yet. Thank you very much, Lawry. One quick question for you. It just says here, would Lawry please mention the revision of AS 2507, the storage and handling of agricultural and veterinary chemicals?
That is happening at the moment. I understand that the Standards Australia is doing that revision. I think the project plan is probably in the next couple of years.
But thank you very much, Lawry.
Right, thank you.